By the 18th and especially the 19th century, bloodletting reached both its apogee and the beginning of its undoing. For in this period it was not only the most frequently performed medical procedure in Europe and the Americas, but also the subject of increasingly bitter debates, as new forms of medical empiricism began to measure outcomes and challenge long-accepted truths. Yet, the cultural hold of venesection was so profound that many of the era's most prominent physicians continued to advocate it with extraordinary enthusiasm. In France, François Victor Broussais, 1772-1838, emerged as perhaps the most notorious champion of bleeding, developing an influential doctrine that linked almost all diseases to inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract and recommending massive and repeated bleedings, often accompanied by the application of dozens of leeches at a time, as the universal remedy. His clinical wards filled with patients weakened by torrents of blood loss. Yet his charisma and institutional power ensured that his methods dominated French medicine for decades, to the point that the demand for leeches became so great that European wetlands were stripped of them, and shipments had to be imported from Russia and beyond, leading to a virtual ecological crisis. Meanwhile, in Britain and the United States, bloodletting remained equally entrenched, with physicians such as Benjamin Rush, 1746-1813, a signer of the American Declaration of Independence and one of the most respected doctors of his age, promoting heroic medicine that included repeated and aggressive venesection for fevers, yellow fever, and even mental illness, insisting that the removal of large volumes of blood was necessary to quell the body's violent excitements. And Rush's prestige ensured that his methods spread widely among American practitioners, so that patients during epidemics were often bled until collapse, with many historians later judging these interventions as accelerating death rather than prolonging life. Yet even as such aggressive doctrines flourished, the seeds of resistance were growing. For clinicians like Pierre-Charles-Alexandre Louis, 1787-1872, in Paris pioneered the numerical method, collecting data on patients systematically and showing statistically that those heavily bled for pneumonia or typhoid fever fared no better, and often worse than those who were not bled. An early application of evidence-based reasoning that directly challenged the dogma of his mentor Broussais. And though Louis's work met resistance, it signaled the beginning of a seismic shift in medical reasoning, one that increasingly prioritized outcomes over tradition. Public opinion, too, began to sour, as famous cases highlighted the dangers of excessive bleeding, the most notorious being the death of George Washington in 1799, when the former president, suffering from a throat infection, was subjected by his physicians to repeated venesections, totaling an estimated 2.5 liters of blood, leaving him profoundly weakened and likely hastening his death, a case that circulated widely and fed skepticism about the wisdom of a therapy that could so visibly sap vitality from the most robust of men. At the same time, advances in pathology and physiology reframed understandings of disease in ways that made humoral explanations less tenable. For with the work of Giovanni Battista Morgagni, 1682-1771, correlating disease with lesions in specific organs, and later Rudolf Virchow, 1821-1902, developing cellular pathology, the focus shifted from systemic humoral imbalance to localized structural and cellular changes, frameworks that left little room for the notion that simply draining blood could restore balance. While the rise of microbiology with Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch further undermined the logic of bleeding by identifying pathogens as specific causes of disease, suggesting that venesection could neither expel germs nor correct the underlying problem. Yet cultural habits die hard, and even as scientific medicine advanced, bloodletting lingered in practice well into the mid-19th century, its decline occurring unevenly across regions and specialties, with some hospitals abandoning it under statistical scrutiny, while rural practitioners and traditionalists continued to prescribe it out of habit or patient expectation. And the practice also persisted in modified forms, such as cupping, which enjoyed periodic revivals, and leeching, which, though diminished, was never entirely abandoned and would eventually find niche indications in reconstructive surgery due to the anticoagulant properties of leech saliva. By the later 19th century, however, The mainstream medical consensus had largely turned against routine venesection, with textbooks and curricula relegating it to a handful of specific indications, such as polycythemia vera, hemochromatosis, or acute congestive states, and dismissing its indiscriminate use as a relic of pre-scientific medicine, so that what had once been the universal remedy was increasingly portrayed as a cautionary tale of how tradition, authority, and cultural belief could blind even the most learned physicians to the dangers of their interventions. And yet the story of bloodletting did not simply end with its abandonment, for it continued to resonate in popular culture, folk medicine, and symbolic understandings of health, its imagery immortalized in barber poles, medical engravings, and the language of bad blood, and its legacy preserved in modern phlebotomy and therapeutic venesection, practices that still echo the ancient conviction that blood, when drawn with precision and intention, might serve as both medicine and metaphor for the restoration of balance in human life. Bloodletting, a practice that stands as one of the most enduring and emblematic interventions in the long and complex history of medicine, begins its story in the mists of antiquity, long before scientific theory or systematic anatomy attempted to explain the inner workings of the human body. For in the earliest societies of Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China, disease was interpreted not merely as a physical malfunction, but as a sign of divine displeasure, imbalance in natural forces, or invasion by malevolent spirits. And in such a worldview, the symbolic act of releasing blood, the vital red fluid that carried life and vigor, was thought to carry profound therapeutic and spiritual significance, so that the earliest forms of bleeding may have been less about precise dosage and more about ritual expulsion of corruption, appeasement of gods, or purging of evil. Archaeological evidence and textual references from Sumerian and Akkadian medical incantations suggest that healers used sharpened reeds or metal lancets to open superficial veins or apply scarification marks, often accompanied by prayers or charms, while Egyptian medicine, as reflected in the Ebers papyrus around 1550 BCE, speaks of blood as a carrier of harmful substances and recommends bleeding and cupping as interventions, with temple physicians combining their roles as priests and healers by treating both the soul and the flesh through ritualized venesection, and the Egyptian concept of the channels, mitu, vessels that carried blood, air, and bodily fluids, foreshadowed later theories of circulation, even as it justified opening the skin to release stagnation, while in the Indian subcontinent, the Sushruta Samhita, c. 600 BCE, describes an elaborate system of bloodletting, rakta mokshana, distinguishing between different methods such as venesection, scarification, and the use of leeches, the latter carefully classified according to their habitats and temperaments, with detailed warnings about poisonous leeches and precise instructions for their application, removal, and aftercare, reflecting not only a symbolic but a proto-scientific approach to balancing the doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha, through the removal of contaminated blood. And indeed, Indian Ayurvedic physicians believed that excess or impure blood produced eruptions, fevers, or swelling, and that properly performed bleeding could restore harmony. Similarly, in early Chinese medicine, the Huangdi Neijing, the yellow, emperor's inner canon, framed illness as a disruption of qi and an imbalance of yin and yang, and while acupuncture became the central modality for redirecting energy through meridians, bloodletting was used selectively at specific points to drain heat, eliminate stagnation, or expel pathogenic factors, often employing fine lancets or three-edged needles to produce a controlled flow, though Chinese physicians generally approached bleeding with more restraint than their Western counterparts, integrating it into a broader therapeutic system rather than elevating it as a universal remedy. But across these ancient cultures, shared conviction emerged that blood was not merely a fluid, but the essence of vitality, and that its controlled removal could re-establish equilibrium between the human body and the larger cosmos. This conceptual foundation set the stage for the Greeks, who beginning in the 5th century BCE began to recast medical ideas into philosophical and naturalistic frameworks, with Hippocrates and his followers proposing the influential humoral theory, in which the body was governed by 4 fundamental humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health, so that disease resulted from excess or deficiency, and since blood was the most abundant and powerful humor, its overabundance was blamed for fevers, inflammations, headaches, and even mental disturbances, making bloodletting not only a logical but a central therapy, while Hippocratic texts such as On the Sacred Disease and aphorisms emphasized observation, prognosis, and the manipulation of humors through diet, regimen, purging, and bleeding, often recommending venesection during specific seasons or in relation to lunar cycles, and the practice grew in sophistication with later Hellenistic physicians like Herophilos and Erasistratus, who dissected human cadavers in Alexandria, distinguished between veins and arteries, and debated the best sites for venesection, though it was Galen of Pergamon, 129 c. 216 CE, the towering figure of Roman medicine, who codified and systematized bloodletting into a vast and detailed therapeutic art, arguing that each disease had its corresponding humor imbalance, and that physicians could manipulate the body's state by carefully selecting which vein to open in which limb and how much blood to remove, a logic he supported with anatomical demonstration and clinical observation. And Galen's influence would prove so profound that for the next 15 centuries across Europe, the Islamic world and beyond, bloodletting was taught, defended, and practiced as a pillar of medicine, its rationale shifting with new interpretations, but its centrality enduring. The Galenic system of bloodletting, entrenched in the intellectual and clinical traditions of the Roman Empire, did not fade after Galen's death, but instead spread through the Byzantine Empire, where medical scholars preserved, copied, and commented on his extensive writings, ensuring that his intricate instructions on venesection, which veins to open for headaches versus fevers, how to regulate bleeding according to age, sex, and temperament, and the importance of moderation in avoiding dangerous depletion, became a standard component of medical teaching. And when the centers of intellectual life shifted to the Islamic world after the fall of Rome, Galen's influence was magnified rather than diminished, for in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, the great translation movement of the 8th through 10th centuries rendered Greek medical texts into Arabic, and scholars such as Hunayn ibn Ishaq, Razis al-Razi, and Avicenna ibn Sina not only preserved Galenic doctrine but expanded upon it, blending it with their own clinical observations and the broader philosophical frameworks of Islamic science. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, perhaps the most influential medical encyclopedia of the medieval era, described in detail when and how bloodletting should be performed, listing contraindications, proper amounts, and specific veins for specific ailments, while Al-Zahrawi, Albucasis, the eminent Andalusian surgeon, provided practical instructions and illustrations of lancets, cupping vessels, and cautery devices, embedding bleeding within a broader surgical repertoire. These works were later translated into Latin in the 12th century and carried into Europe, where they became foundational texts in the universities of Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris, reinforcing Galenic and Arabic authority in scholastic medicine. And so by the High Middle Ages, bloodletting had become not only a treatment, but a ritualized part of medical and even social life, performed by both learned physicians and barber surgeons, the latter easily recognizable by their iconic red and white striped poles, said to represent the bandages and blood associated with their trade. And while university-trained doctors debated the fine theoretical distinctions of humors and the merits of opening the basilic versus the cephalic vein, barber surgeons traveled towns and villages, lancing, cupping, and applying leeches to a wide clientele, their work regulated by guilds that distinguished them from barbers who only cut hair. In this period, bleeding was often prescribed prophylactically, recommended at certain times of year, spring being favored for its supposed humoral shifts, and connected to astrology, with physicians consulting zodiac charts to determine the safest and most effective times for venesection, avoiding, for example, bleeding a limb when the moon was in a sign governing that part of the body, a system known as iatromathematics that fused medicine with cosmology. Beyond the universities and towns, monasteries also kept the practice alive, for monks were bled regularly as part of their regimen of health and discipline, with monastic rules specifying the frequency of phlebotomy, both for purification and for the supposed weakening of carnal desires. And monastic infirmaries often became centers where knowledge of bloodletting and other therapies was preserved and disseminated. During epidemics such as the Black Death in the 14th century, bloodletting was often attempted as a desperate measure, though its effectiveness against plague was non-existent, and critics as well as supporters noted the dangers of excessive bleeding, yet the procedure persisted, reinforced by centuries of tradition and by the prestige of the Galenic system, which allowed for flexibility of interpretation that could accommodate almost any outcome. If the patient improved, the bleeding was judged successful, and if the patient worsened, it was argued that the illness had been too advanced or the bleeding insufficient, an unfalsifiable framework that protected the practice from empirical disconfirmation. In parallel, the use of leeches, which had been mentioned in Ayurvedic and Greco-Roman texts, became increasingly popular in Europe, particularly for delicate areas such as around the eyes, ears and anus where incision was difficult, and by the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, leeching was considered a refined alternative to crude venesection, promoted as gentler and more controlled. Though in reality, leeches could extract significant volumes of blood and introduce infection. Thus, by the 15th and 16th centuries, bloodletting was thoroughly woven into the medical fabric of Europe and the Islamic world alike, its tools refined, its justifications elaborated, and its practitioners ranging from elite court physicians who prescribed complex bleeding regimens for kings and nobles to itinerant barbers who carried their basins and lancets from market to market. And despite occasional voices of skepticism, the weight of authority, tradition, and cultural expectation ensured that few could imagine medicine without the letting of blood, setting the stage for its extraordinary endurance into the Renaissance and early modern period, even as new scientific discoveries began to chip away at the intellectual foundations on which it rested. As Europe entered the Renaissance and early modern period, bloodletting not only retained its central place in medical practice, but was invigorated by the renewed study of classical texts, the revival of anatomical dissection, and the emergence of new print technologies that allowed medical treatises, surgical manuals, and anatomical atlases to circulate more widely than ever before, ensuring that Galenic principles of venesection, elaborated and refracted through Arabic commentators, continued to be disseminated in increasingly standardized forms. Yet at the same time, the Renaissance spirit of inquiry, with its emphasis on direct observation of nature, began to generate tensions between traditional authority and empirical evidence. Figures such as Andreas Vesalius, 1514-1564, whose monumental De Humani Corporis Fabrica corrected many of Galen's anatomical errors, nevertheless did not abandon bloodletting, but rather refined its anatomical justifications, using his dissections to provide more accurate diagrams of veins and arteries, thereby reinforcing the sense that phlebotomy, when properly guided by true knowledge of the body, was not only legitimate but indispensable. While Ambroise Paré, 1510-1590, the great French surgeon, though skeptical of overzealous bleeding, still recommended it in certain conditions, and his surgical writings contained detailed discussions of venesection, cupping, and leeching. In this period, the barber surgeon's craft gained increasing regulation, with guilds distinguishing the roles of learned physicians who prescribed bleeding according to humoral theory, from surgeons who carried it out with lancet and bowl, and manuals of phlebotomy were produced in vernacular languages to instruct practitioners on the precise locations of veins, the proper stance of the patient, and the correct angle of incision, often illustrated with woodcuts depicting human figures marked with zodiac signs and veins labeled for specific diseases, images that served as both practical guides and symbolic representations of the interconnectedness of body and cosmos. Yet even as these practices flourished, a scientific undercurrent began to stir, most dramatically with William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood, published in De Motu Cordis, 1628, which overturned the Galenic notion that blood was continuously produced and consumed by the liver, and instead demonstrated that blood circulated in a closed system powered by the heart, an insight that fundamentally undermined the rationale for indiscriminate bleeding. For if blood was not an endlessly replenished humor, but a finite circulating volume, then its removal carried graver risks than Galen had envisioned, and indeed some contemporaries recognized the implications, But cultural inertia and the entrenched authority of humoralism ensured that bleeding persisted, often reinterpreted in light of Harvey's discovery rather than abandoned. In the 17th and 18th centuries, medicine remained bound to humoral explanations, yet the practice of bloodletting became ever more codified, with elaborate charts specifying exactly how many ounces of blood should be drawn for fevers, inflammations or apoplexies, and physicians debated endlessly whether it was better to bleed from the arm nearest the site of disease, derivative bleeding, or from the opposite side, revulsive bleeding, with case reports and polemics filling the medical journals of the Enlightenment. In France, physicians such as Jean-Baptiste Sénac defended phlebotomy for cardiac conditions, while in England the eminent physician Thomas Sydenham, sometimes called the English Hippocrates, though less enamored of bleeding than some of his peers, still employed it liberally in cases of fever and pleurisy, his reputation ensuring that the practice remained fashionable. While in continental Europe, medical faculties continued to drill students in the principles and procedures of venesection as an essential component of their education. Outside the university and hospital, bleeding also became a domestic practice, with manuals for household medicine recommending venesection or leeching for common ailments, and itinerant practitioners traveling from village to village with portable cupping sets and boxes of leeches, their services sought by rich and poor alike. For the cultural conviction that excess blood was the root of many ills remained so strong that even when patients fainted or died following bleeding, it was often interpreted as evidence that the disease itself had been too severe or that the bleeding had not been timely enough. Yet alongside this widespread acceptance, new forms of skepticism began to appear, for the experimental spirit of the Enlightenment increasingly demanded empirical evidence of efficacy, and clinical statistics, rudimentary though they were, sometimes revealed alarming mortality rates among heavily bled patients, while alternative theories of disease, mechanical, chemical, or nervous, began to challenge humoralism, offering different causal explanations that did not always require the letting of blood, though the sheer weight of custom and authority ensured that bleeding remained the go-to intervention well into the 18th century. Even as anatomical knowledge, experimental physiology, and a growing culture of empiricism quietly eroded its theoretical foundations, setting the stage for the heated controversies and eventual decline of bloodletting in the modern era.